Michael Oshlink here, and I'm talking to Max Border, who is the founder and executive director of Social Evolution. Max is also the co-founder of the Voice and Exit event and former editor of the Future for Economic Education, known as FEE. Max is a futurist, a theorist, a published author, and entrepreneur. How you doing, Max?
Doing great. Thank you for having me.
Great to have you here. So before we jump into some of these cool organizations you've created, like Social Evolution and Voice and Exit, talk to us about how you became a futurist, an entrepreneur. What's kind of your background, your story?
Sure. So I think, there are a lot of steps along the way in this path, but for the purposes of concision and keeping your audience, I'd say probably the two main ones are I have academic training in philosophy. That's my background. That's what I went to college for in graduate school, and taught in higher education for a while. And so there has always been and always will be a philosopher in me. But, sort of teaching philosophy as a lecturer isn't the most lucrative thing. And I ended up meeting my wife while teaching. And so I had a couple of diversions. One of those diversions happened. I was writing for Accenture Tech Labs long ago, 1999, 2000, 2001, and that sort of pulled my interest into emerging technologies. And emerging technologies, anyone with a philosophical bent or eyes on the horizon is going to get into futurism. And so the philosopher merges with the sort of the futurist, and sort of here we are. I mean, there are more steps along the way, but that's more or less the path in terms of the two initial catalysts.
In terms of philosophy, would you consider yourself like a transhumanist philosophically?
I would. I mean, that's only a facet of the philosophy I studied and that I appreciate, but certainly transhumanism is one part of it. I'm certainly comfortable with the idea of augmenting ourselves to live longer, to have enhanced cognitive abilities, and so on. I think this is an interesting path and has a degree of inevitability to it. A lot of people aren't comfortable with the idea of enhancing ourselves, but I think people will start to change that tune once they see that in order to be competitive, humans will have to augment themselves not to compete with machines along every dimension, because I think there are uniquely human things that we can create economies around, but certainly augmenting our cognitive abilities, and even our spiritual selves is in our future.
Well, actually, that might be an interesting path for us to explore a little bit. So, in terms of augmenting your cognition, spiritual training and experience, kind of where do you come from? What have you played around with? Where are you going with that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I've played around a little bit with some minor biohacking. I've never had any sort of implant. I don't know if I would be the first to try some sort of neural interface with technology, with the internet or something like that, although I do think that's coming.
Yep.
Nootropics is one of the things I've experimented with, a number of different nootropics. I've been using one today called Qualia.
Yeah.
It's run by a guy, Jordan Greenhall, and founded by a bunch of him and his very bright friends. It's been a pretty good product. I'm not here to shill for this product. I just happen to really like it and using it.
It's Neurohacktive Collective, right?
I'm a sucker for butter coffee.
Oh, okay. Dave Asprey would be happy.
He would. He definitely would.
But you mentioned spirituality. Do you consider yourself a spiritual seeker? And if so, is there a certain lineage you're part of, or practices you do on a regular basis?
No, I'm kind of a baby spiritually in terms of my development, and I don't want to understate it or overstate it. But let's just say that it was only in my late 30s that I had a peak experience that sounded like it was straight out of William James. In fact, I wrote down my experiences and then looked back at William James and thought, oh my gosh, this guy beat us to the punch. And that sort of set me on a path to becoming less. I still consider myself a physicalist in terms of the way the world is from the standpoint of metaphysics. But I do think that there are spiritual pathways that someone who's had a peak experience like this might be willing to explore. These are the psychonauts of meditation and so on, who have been practicing for millennia. There's certainly something to their journeys and something to the therapeutic benefits of their practices, which I would not have appreciated 10 years ago nearly as much as I do now. And so I'm very much a baby, an acolyte to this path, but I've certainly been set down it.
Well, if you ever consider yourself a master of the path, God or spirit or your higher self or some other person is going to knock you off and remind you that you're always an acolyte. You mentioned William James. You talked about transhumanism. Are there other philosophers and philosophies which kind of inform the way you think about the world and live your life?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been infatuated with the classical liberal tradition in political philosophy. I think it's an important and not only important, but is probably most profoundly informed my political philosophy, as it were. I mean, there are other things I did in my academic training. I did philosophy of mind and theory of knowledge, but I think from the standpoint of political philosophy, the classical liberal tradition, from say, even the classics through Hobbes, Locke, up to traditional analytic philosophy in the English-speaking tradition, I've really had profound influences. Robert Nozick, John Rawls, David Gautier, and so on. These have been super influential on me, and I continue to be inspired and go back to them as a resource and a reservoir of thought. My thinking has evolved over the years in terms of my political philosophy, and I'm less doctrinaire now, I think, than I used to be. And I can talk about the reasons why, because I think a lot of philosophy tends to be sort of a detached reasoning self that deals with ideals, and that's okay to an extent. We can look at our ideals and try to work sort of asymptotically towards those ideals, but that process of operating on the asymptote is in the real world, and it has to do with culture, technology, limits to our bodies. And so my sort of in the clouds academic background has taken a backseat to a very pragmatic and interested in the world kind of forward path that we can talk about later.
Yeah. Have you ever read any of the somatic-oriented writers who integrate somatic psychology, embodied self, and philosophy?
I'm not sure. You might give me an example, but
Don Johnson, he's a professor at the California Institute for Integral Studies, has written maybe about a half a dozen books. Not all of them are necessarily philosophical in nature, but he does kind of explore what's it like to be an embodied being in our world today, and the disconnect between felt experience, lived experience, and our culture, which in many cases kind of denies the inner self and just looks at us as objects moving through time and space.
I've heard this person's name and read references to his work. I'm almost certain. I'd say the closest to that, and this is probably familiar to your audience, would be Ken Wilber.
Oh, yeah.
I've really enjoyed, and I was surprised to enjoy the work of Ken Wilber. I think it's fantastic stuff, and I think in terms of my transformation and development has played a big part in that. But that's the closest to integral type stuff I've come. I've touched on a couple of the other thinkers in that space, and I haven't been quite as impressed with them as Ken Wilber. But certainly, and sort of adjacent to that, also the I don't know if you would call it integral, but certainly there's overlap in the in the work of Beck and Cowan, based on the spiral dynamics,
right,
which is a more psychosocial development. However, I think they're both connected in interesting ways, and I have enjoyed exploring that connection.
Well, actually, it's a great segue because one of your newer organizations that you're executive director of is Social Evolution. Evolution fits into the Weberian ideal. It fits into the Graves or the spiral dynamics ideal as well. You can actually find, I would imagine, within some of the classical thinkers, if you add economics and the Hayekian worldview, it's kind of evolutionary, organic evolutionary, and its dynamism. Talk to us a little bit about that new organization and how the name relates to what we just talked about, if at all.
Sure. Well, and it's wonderful in that it can be a Rorschach, but I certainly appreciate the Gravesian model reference that one could ascribe to it, and I'm happy to ascribe to it, because I think what I'm trying to do, for those who are not familiar with it, can I assume your audience is, or should I go over it quickly?
You can go over it quickly.
Okay.
Sure.
In the Gravesian model, essentially, and how it's been adapted, I'll use the latter adaptation. They consider human development, human psychosocial development, or biopsychosocial. I think let's just stick with psychosocial. That's good enough. And the values in that development, we go through certain stages that they believe spiral upward or ascend through a spiral. It's represented by colors within two tiers. The first tier is starts at a very simple level at a beige color, which is the values of survival, and it goes up to red, which is the values of the ego, conquest and sex and getting money. This is we can see this very much represented in the empires of the Roman Empire and adjacent empires. Beyond that, there were excesses probably historically for that sort of red sensibility. I'm sorry, I skipped over purple. Excuse me. Purple comes before red. Purple is the tribal animist level, which is you're part of a tribe, you're part of a community, and when you die, you might still be according to these values. So they're very much about generally about ancestor worship and animism, which is sort of the veneration of objects around you in your environment. So if things are happening willy-nilly in your environment, it's sort of a proto-science to try to understand that and deal with it as a tribe. And of course, you need your tribe to survive. So that's right after beige is purple. Then the egoistic red, once you sort of step out of the tribe a little bit and start to conquer and learn the benefits of conquest. And I hate to say there are benefits to conquest, but there certainly were to those who conquered. But those excesses needed to be reined in, and they go to blue, and blue is more like deference to a higher power, veneration of a higher power, and then sort of a hierarchical arrangement based on that, where everyone should know their place, and there should be loyalty to the hierarchy and loyalty to the structure of society. And this is sort of the familiar values of what we might call conservative America, even, or parts of the developing world who have needed to rein in the excesses of red. But there are some people within the blue who started thinking, particularly and ironically within the cloister, they started thinking about things more. They wanted to understand the nature of reality in a way that the scientific process would give them, and they began to think in more commercial terms about the benefits of exchange and the benefits of productivity. So this sort of scientific commercial stratum was built on top of blue, and that's orange. But of course, a lot of people think capitalism as such has its excesses, and certainly there are examples of excesses in capitalism, both in capitalism and in science. There's a spiritual malnourishment that can occur, and so some of the response to this was kind of the hippie culture of the 60s. And so you get to green, which is the very top of the first level, and green is about consensus, it's about egalitarianism, i.e. equality, and it's about a basic respect for the environment. So there we have there's sort of stages of psychosocial development according to Beck and Cowan for the first tier. But then there's a big leap to the second tier. And the second tier, the first tier of the first layer of the second tier is called yellow. And yellow is really about beginning to think in terms of systems. It's being able to start to integrate and transcend all of the important aspects of the prior levels of development and integrate them into your worldview and understand the benefits and the excesses of each. So once you reach yellow, you can really think in systemic terms. You can start to see how things work more organically with respect. So I think, you mentioned Hayek.
Right.
I think certainly Hayek is a yellow, is yellow in his orientation, with maybe sort of swatches of cognitive swatches at the next level, which is turquoise. And turquoise is considered to be the highest level at the moment, it is a level that deals with the relationships of parts and wholes, holons, nested subsystems, and being able to see the entire system as a whole, which is a difficult thing to do, and it also has, for many, a spiritual dimension that requires us to think much and less in dualistic terms, which is often what first-tier thinkers do. They think in dualities. They think in stark binaries. And so, period, paragraph, that was a lot of stuff. But the punchline to that is, I think a very, very important part or submission for social evolution is to begin to get people thinking not in first-tier terms, but in as much as possible allowing them to get to second-tier thinking, because second-tier thinking reconciles so many of the things that seem, particularly today, at odds with each other. So that's definitely operating in the background of my thinking, and that means that social evolution is not for everyone. It's I don't want to sound elitist, but it's for people who are ready to think and behave and organize society along second-tier lines.
As Ken Wilber says, it's an elitism which everyone's invited to.
Exactly.
Right. All right, so talk to me, literally, what does the organization Social Evolution do? I understand the theoretical framework which you operate out of.
Great. Well, yeah, I mean, from a brass tacks standpoint, our mission is to liberate people and solve social problems through innovation. And it's in this emphasis on innovation, I think that's really the promising thing, because right now we're in such a time of revolutionary change that some of the systems and structures we take for granted that are around us are about to be transformed or completely obviated. Okay, and so what social evolution does as an entity, our first order of business is just to be a publication that generates articles and thought about this, so that we can start to reach as many people as possible, welcoming them into second-tier thinking, but also welcoming them away from the political frame, which tends to be binary, and into the innovative frame, which tends to be non-binary. In other words, capitalism versus socialism is very binary thinking. But you can have community and freedom at the same time reconciled. Mm-hmm. And the way you do that, in a most promising way right now, is not through politics, it's through innovation. So the blockchain right now is a very good example of how the mediating structures of society, media,
excuse me.
Bless you.
Thank you.
Media, politics, philanthropy, education, science, all of these mediating structures that we currently know are about to be transformed. Some of them are already fallen. I think it's arguable, but I think the media has already fallen as a mediating structure because it's no longer hierarchically arranged. The internet essentially has already killed this, what Jordan Greenhall calls the blue church, a hierarchical structure of the media. And we're going to see some of these other mediating structures start to fall. Social evolution wants to catalyze that process and help people prepare for it, because both things are important.
Right on. Can you give me some examples of some of the things you're either doing to help facilitate that process, support the process, or writing about it, to recognize it, to educate people, so they, as I like to say, reduce the transition costs. Because if you're aware it's coming, you can prepare yourself mentally and emotionally and spiritually for it.
Yeah. So we only now, as of the spring, late spring, got our 501c3, but
Cool.
We do have it.
Cool. Congratulations.
So very very little that has been done except fundraising at this point.
Cool.
However, I've been able to write, for example, an article for the Cato Institute, which is sort of a libertarian think tank in the political frame. And they generally operate in politics, policy, and punditry, which is an absolutely fine frame. But the article I proposed, and Jason Kuznicki over there is a great guy who published the article, and he and I agree fundamentally that we need to start looking at innovation as another mechanism of social change,
Mm-hmm.
because most people are trapped in this and anchored to this idea that social change has to come through politics, which
Mm-hmm.
is zero-sum at best, negative-sum most of the time.
What's the title of the article? So I'd like to link to it in the show notes.
Absolutely. I think it's called, let me see, the audience will forgive me.
Problem.
It's called Reframing the Libertarian Movement. And it's about this idea of subversive innovation. That is, innovation that is likely to change or obsolete or change these mediating structures
Mm-hmm.
and social hierarchies that exist that needed to be around but have outlived their usefulness.
So,
And for us to pass from this moral political frame to this innovative frame.
So let me ask you, as a transhumanist and someone who's promoting innovation as a framework, not as opposed to, but in addition to policy. So I'm very interested in like the Singularity University and all the really interesting innovations in tech related to human health, biotech, genetic manipulation, nanotechnology, all that kind of stuff. Fascinating stuff. Fits in really well with all the stuff you already said. But, as you know, probably, I'm also involved in the paleo world. And I know you have a lot of deep connections there as well.
Sure.
So, that's less technologically oriented, it's more lifestyle oriented. So I'm wondering where for you, not that there's a dividing line, because you're about integration, but where does not transcending the limits of our biology, but living within our biological systems as part of an ecological system, like how does that, and lifestyle as it relates to all that, where does that fit into your thinking?
So I think we can I think we can talk about a couple of things along this dimension. I'm not sure if I'm going to just go for it and see if this somewhat answers your question. But let's start with lifestyle. Start with what I consider to be an easy one. This is another area where we saw a mediating structure toppled. Okay. Let me give you an example. You said paleo lifestyle, something you're interested in. I am too, to some degree. In fact, I consider myself mostly paleo, but I have weak moments. I live in Austin, Texas. We have really, really good corn chips, and I weaken from time to time.
I'm going to tell Keith to keep an eye on you, man.
Yeah, he needs to. Paleo as a movement really started out with people think of it as who were outside of the paleo movement think of it as kind of quasi-religious. It's based on a theory of, loosely on a theory of the way the body must have operated throughout human evolutionary history. And of course, we didn't have all these processed things back in those days, cookies and candies and super sugars and carbohydrates and all this stuff. We had basically, meat and berries that we hunted and gathered, and maybe some tubers in the ground and so on, and some, small, a little bit of carbohydrates, but a lot of protein and a lot of greens and berries. So the diet is more or less a biohack to try to say, hey, I want to live a healthy lifestyle. Let me try to approximate that in my diet. It's not meant to be religious zeal. A lot of people are zealous about it, and they just want to be super healthy, and that's fine. For me, it's a biohack. It's a way of saying, okay, I want to live a really healthy lifestyle. I want to look good into my 40s, 50s, and so on, and be able to consume these calories and also, stay healthy for my kids and my family. Mm-hmm. But so did a lot of other people. So you got these biohackers, and they're already well into the internet era, and they start talking. So they try things on themselves and they talk. They try things on themselves and they talk. They get a little information from over here and they talk. And this peer-to-peer network of communication brought down 40 years of orthodoxy when it comes to diet and nutrition. Butter's back because of paleo.
Yep.
Sugar's dead because of paleo. High carb, low fat diet is dead because of paleo. It may not be that the Paleolithic diet is perfect, but it is certainly far, far preferable a diet to what was being, told to us by doctors and authorities for 40 years plus. So this is one of those situations where a peer-to-peer network of people who are amateurs in some respects, in many respects, mm-hmm. Some amateurs, some not, but they started talking and their information was being filtered and tried and retried, brought down the hierarchical, peer-reviewed, doctor, research center, industrial complex that handed down the information through hierarchical chains, and we followed blindly for years. This is exactly what I'm talking about okay. Bringing down certain mediating structures, or at least part of mediating structures, or correcting them at the very least. This process is going to come in waves of creative destruction for all the mediating structures around us that are hierarchical.
So like banking, energy, food, fitness, medicine, transportation.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Clothing.
We're going to learn so much by networking people. Mm-hmm. You combine that with data aggregation, big data, mm-hmm. And artificial intelligence, and and the blockchain. You start to combine all these factors. It's going to be it's going to take the ground underneath our feet on so many dimensions of life, and we've got to be ready for that. We are in an unprecedented age of accelerated change. So it's going to benefit us, and it's going to pull the bases that we've gotten used to out from under us. So being prepared for both of those things is really what social evolution is about.
So I have a general theory, not necessarily applicable to every single human being, that we tend to be conservative, not politically but biologically. We like to conserve energy. We like our habits. The more energy we save, the more likely we'll survive. It's kind of like the template that drives us over time. And of course, there's outliers, people who like novelty and are not so conservative. But it seems to me most of the people I've met in my life tend to be more conservative that way. How do you, if that's true, or at least a subset of us as a species are like that, how do you reach those folks who aren't ready for the exponential changes that we're now in the midst of, but we're going to get more crazy, dynamic, chaotic in the very near future, especially with some of the technologies we've already talked about, nanotech, biotech, genetic engineering, things along those lines.
Yeah, I think some of it is talking to people, and certainly I'm, as a nonprofit organization, Social Evolution is in the business of talking to people, of communicating, creating cool content and saying, hey, let's share this idea. As we said, there really is an emphasis on bringing people into the second tier, or feeding people already in the second tier with good memes, I guess you could say. But I think there is, for lack of a better way of putting it, a communication to trickle-down effect that can happen. But I think the more important thing, so with respect to communicating these ideas, getting people where people join networks, experiment, talk, and experiment, network, talk, and replicate ideas. This is the way a lot of this works. So that's one part of it. The second thing is about a lot of this stuff is it's not going to happen necessarily first through communication. Let me give you a couple of examples.
Please.
think of innovation and culture as a co-evolutionary process. So there's a vacillating tandem between culture and innovation, back and forth, back and forth. Okay, this will also include institutional change, which we'll bundle that in a minute if you want to talk about that. But it gets really complicated really quickly. Just focusing on these two dimensions, culture and innovation. We can think about an innovation that has completely transformed our culture just in the last 5 years. 5 years ago, I would submit to you that 90% of the population would never get into a car with a stranger or sleep in a stranger's house.
Okay.
5 years later, it is completely commonplace. In fact, just 2 days ago, I did both of those things because I was at a conference giving a talk on this very thing.
Cool.
And you think about that vacillating tandem between culture and innovation, and it doesn't stop. So we completely transformed the culture of mistrust around getting in someone's car with innovation. And likewise, we think of the 1960s, the birth control pill.
Yeah.
The catalyst for the sexual revolution of the 60s. And, then there was the AIDS epidemic of the 80s and 90s. And so people had to recalibrate their thinking after the sexual revolution because there was a problem with disease, particularly, it started in the gay community and quickly bled into mainstream society. So there was a recalibration of that culture, and technology responded with AIDS, with HIV drugs that have been very successful at keeping people alive for a very long time. And so there has been now, a change in behavior relative to that. So that vacillating tandem between technology and culture is super important to pay attention to and to recognize its power. So likewise, some of the things that we think we might have to persuade people who, as you put it, are conservative or, wedded to the status quo, and this doesn't mean necessarily Republican or Democrat, anything, that social change, the quickest way to get someone to change is get them to realize the benefits immediately. And they will.
Wow.
The benefits of some technology, for example.
Mm-hmm. So I just imagine that you'd have some individuals who are kind of on the cutting edge and exploring and experimenting, as you kind of mentioned, experimentation. And then eventually just becomes background noise in the culture. Because I was just thinking like Uber or Lyft, you're right. Like there's some cutting edge people who would try it, and now it's like no big deal, especially for the younger generation. Like that's how they travel around. And you talked about institutions that kind of fit somewhere in the middle, and they have to not necessarily fit in the middle, but they have to adjust to the dynamics between innovation and culture, transportation, housing, as major institutions. And I have to imagine banking and other such things that are kind of the backbone behind, and taxation and construction and all, everything, all those kind of institutions which play in those areas will have to adjust accordingly or fight the change and lose, but
or become really, really authoritarian really fast, because that's going to be the only thing that works. And it's not even clear that can last forever. It might be temporary way of keeping networked people under your thumb by threatening them, because they just become so scared, and your territorial reach is so extensive and strong that you're able to do that. But that is really scary, that it would have to be that kind of response to stop this process. So we need to be prepared for that too.
Yeah, I spend, unfortunately, a good amount of my time dealing with that, the corporate state surveillance and all that kind of good stuff. But okay, so we talked a little bit about social evolution. You also are the co-founder of Voice and Exit. So Max, what's Voice and Exit?
Yeah, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention my co-founder, Seth Blaustein, who is a fantastically talented guy. Voice and Exit was born out of basically I'd had this desire to do sort of an alternative TED event, and as these things will, I met this guy, and we were chatting and drinking. When people drink, they do stupid things. So he had a similar idea about an alternative TED, and we started talking, and we were like, well, let's do it, because he had a film background and a production background, and I have, this crazy philosophical futurist background. And once we got to talking, we realized that this was something we wanted to try. We had our prototype year in 2013, and the basic idea of this sort of alternative TED conference, it's been described by others. I don't like to say this because burners are like, nothing is like Burning Man, and it's true, but it's indoor burning. TED meets Burning Man sort of has that vibe.
Okay.
And that's, with all respect to Burning Man, the Burning Man phenomenon, but we are very happy to be imbued with that brush just a little bit. So the conference is really about similar themes. In what ways are people pioneering different things along different dimensions of life? And Voice and Exit really does include some of these things that you're talking about in terms of lifestyle, diet, consciousness. I sometimes hesitate to use consciousness. I think it can be used as kind of like a cognitive shortcut or bludgeon for things for some people, without all that much reflection or even spirituality. But suffice it to say that community really likes Voice and Exit, and we like them. But it really is an integrated way of looking at the world. It's sort of let me just tell you for a moment about the name Voice and Exit. So the idea behind the name comes from Albert Hirschman, who was an old Harvard thinker, I think political scientist maybe. But anyway, his idea comes from the book Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. Exit, Voice, and Loyalty there's essentially, three aspects of social change. One is voice, which is, if I don't like something within some system, then I can gripe about it. That's sort of democracy. We can agitate, we can protest, we can write a letter to the editor, that sort of thing. But if nothing changes in that system, if the costs are low enough, we can exit that system and start something new. And that's the exit part. The loyalty, I'll just pass over that. Not because loyalty isn't important, but sometimes people have brand loyalty and system loyalty. America, no matter what the system is, I'm a diehard American. Or if the system is, by golly, I drink Coke, and even if they change the formula, I'm still going to be a Coke drinker.
I'm a Republican. I'm a Democrat.
Right, exactly. No matter how much the party changes, the platform changes, by golly, I'm still a donkey or an elephant. Exactly. Yeah. So Voice and Exit really is sort of a nod to that, saying the human algorithm is to speak up, to think together, to try to think creatively about change and talk to each other. But if that doesn't work, to go out and try something new. Our mantra is criticized by creating. Crazy tell for us to try to, and that we got that from Michael Strong, by the way, who's a very, very good friend and mentor, and we've used that as our mantra, and absolutely, really ridiculous branding to try to build an organization and an event around something so abstract as this, but we've done it, and people get it when they come, and its reputation has grown tremendously.
Wow, that's fantastic. So, Max, if people are interested in learning about social evolution, how do they find you on the web?
Sure. I have a sort of a landing page set up right now for that. You can get the basics, and that's social-evolution.com. It is a nonprofit, so I didn't use the org because the com is sort of a placeholder for later when we want to do a cool publication. And obviously, folks, if they have an inclination, can contribute to that with Bitcoin or
better be Bitcoin. You better have cyber currency in there or cryptocurrency.
Absolutely. I wouldn't dare have this message without that there. And then Voice and Exit is voiceandexit.com, and you can see. We'll be updating that website soon. There's still some information from last year's event, but you can see the kind of stuff that's on offer, and if it's interesting to your audience. make plans for May 2018 in Austin.
Sweet. And you've written as well and spoken. Can we go to like YouTube and do a search on you and find your talks, things along those lines?
Yeah, I've got lots of stuff on there. Depending on people's interest, I would love for you to take a look and contact me if you're interested in having a conversation about anything. I do have YouTube talks, and
cool.
Of course, I used to be editor of Foundation for Economic Education, FEE.org, and I spent 3 wonderful years there. I still have a place in my heart for FEE, and you can read a lot of my stuff from those years on there. That probably comes up first when you Google me.
If you send me your top 3 or 4, I'll make sure they're included in the show notes.
I'd be happy to.
Sweet. Also, send me a link to the Cato article that you wrote as well.
No problem.
Include that as well. Well, Max Borders, this is fun talking to you. Hopefully this is the beginning of many future conversations.
Man, I had a blast. Thank you so much, Michael.
Cool. I'll talk to you soon.